guys, this is going to be a tier list for the difficulty level of doing veteran trials from the beginner perspective. So like, if you go into a trial for the very first time, you've never done it before, and you're the main tank, we're going to rate these trials based on how difficult we think they are from a main tank perspective for someone who has never done them before. So that is the idea of this tier list. Okay? Start off the tier list, so S tier would be the most difficult. So something that is extremely difficult to do is going into the S tier. So first of all, Aetherian Archive. So, Aetherian Archive, how do we tier this in terms of how easy is Aetherian Archive for a main tank for the absolute beginner? Like if you've never done a vet trial before, you've never done a veteran trial before, what do we reckon for Aetherian Archive? Now, you've got to bear in mind that dealing with the axes on the last boss isn't that easy for somebody who's never done it before. If we're looking at the idea of having to tank 3 or 4 axes, I don't think it's quite F tier. I think it's actually a little bit more difficult than that. Tanking those axes is not an easy feat, I don't think. Like 2 axes is okay. When you start getting to 3 or 4, start to get a bit more tricky. We're not gonna. This is not hard mode. We're just going base level trials, base veteran trials. So I do think it's easy. Obviously, we can adjust these later, but I do think that it's kind of there for me in the middle, because it's not real easy, but it's not super difficult, because you can actually go through the whole of Aetherian Archive without blocking until the last boss. Like, I don't think veteran Aetherian Archive is... It's somewhere here, I would say. We can reevaluate this after. We can reevaluate it after, guys. So we'll go back. Right, next we've got Hel Ra. Now, Hel Ra is a... When you take Aetherian Archive's difficult because it's a sustain heavy fight for the main tank. So if you're a brand new player, you go in there, you've got 3-4 axes to tank. You've got to know how to sustain. That's the main difficulty there. When you go to Hel Ra, it's completely different. It's not a sustain heavy fight, but however, it's a high damage fight, because that last boss, boom, it can really, really hurt if you don't know how to, if you don't dodge roll sometimes maybe, if you don't have enough stamina, if you don't know how to sustain. So I think like Hel Ra is a little bit easier than Aetherian Archive personally. But then you've got the big ad pull before the last boss, which is really hard. That's that massive ad pull where you've got like 50 ads to tank, and it's impossible to tank them all if you're not using the Tormentor set. But I do think it is a bit easier. The only thing I will say is, with Aetherian Archive, you don't have to block. There isn't a single boss in Aetherian Archive that you need to actually block as the main tank until you get to the last boss and you've got the axes. Hel Ra's the complete opposite. The first boss can kill you if you're not blocking. It can one-shot you, and it can also kill you with its spin. So you do actually have to block that. Then the second boss, if you do the downstairs boss as the main tank, you've got all the Welwers, and when they enrage, they do an armor shred, and they really hurt as well. So maybe they are kind of the same. Maybe they are kind of similar, because this is like easy, but really sustain heavy last boss. And then this is like more block intensive, because it's much higher damage. Next trial, Sanctum Ophidia. The way that I see the Craglorn trials is Vet AA teaches you sustain. Hel Ra teaches you high damage. And then in the middle, you got Sanctum, which teaches you team cohesion. Because it's all about teamwork in Sanctum. The other two doesn't really matter. Sanctum requires 2 tanks. You've usually got, like obviously the main tank and the off tank, and they've got to share the ad pull duties. They've got to pull this in, tank that, do that, do that. You go over there and tank that. You come over here and do that. There's a bit of like cohesion required between 2 tanks, so it's kind of teaching you teamwork. So I think it's 3 critical lessons that you learn from those 3 trials. Like I say, Vet AA teaches you sustaining a hard hitting fight. Hel Ra teaches you how to deal with big amounts of damage, and then VSO is just like teamwork. I do think it's probably more difficult though, because you actually have to have certain positioning. Do you know what I mean? Like, you can cleave your whole group and kill them if you don't have the last boss position properly. You can get knocked through the door if you tank the Lamia boss, the snake boss in the wrong place. You can get thrown. You can die on the first boss if everybody doesn't block in your group and you don't have any heals on you. It's mostly an annoyance more than difficult, I would say, though. I don't think it's super difficult. I think it's more annoying. It's definitely more difficult in a way that it's more challenging because it's longer. Maybe one tier harder, but... See, the thing is, in a minute, when we start adding in the DLC trials, we're going to start to evaluate, actually, these are probably even lower down because the other ones come in at different places. Well, we'll look at it in a second. We'll reevaluate it, but we'll put it there. But maybe it's a D. Maybe these should go down to E. We'll see in a second. Okay. The next one, Maw of Lorkhaj. Maw of Lorkhaj. Now, the way you've got to think about this is, if you were a brand new tank, you've never done like, you're doing Maw of Lorkhaj for the first time ever. You're the main tank. You've never done it. You're going in there for the first time. It's on there. How difficult is this fight for a new player that has never done it before? I think Maw of Lorkhaj is one of the highest difficulty levels, to be honest. See, I think it's quite high tier. You've got the twins. You've got to remember the twins. And they've got to stay, they've got to swap, they've got to chain the ads in. They're going to have to potentially switch sides with the other tank on the boss. If you do the last boss, you've got the machine gun. You've also got to switch pad. You've got to make sure the boss is positioned correctly. You've got to make sure you run around the pad to avoid the meteors. There's like a lot of things happening for me in as like a main tank in Maw of Lorkhaj. I think this is quite high in difficulty, personally. So this is where now, this is looking like these need to drop down. Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of mechanics, exactly, that's what I mean. On the first boss, you've got to hold the boss in the middle. You've then got the curse, so you've got to go and cleanse, you've got to come back, you've got to take the boss back. You've got to pull the ads in, you've got to root the ads. You've got to be careful you don't get hit too much by the ads because you get the armor shatter. You've then got the explosion mechanic where you've got to go and hide behind the pillar. Like, that's quite a lot of mechanics when you consider Vetier doesn't require any blocking. Hel Ra requires you to just stand there and block and do almost nothing. Sanctum requires you to only really tank effectively for the ad pulls, and then the bosses are quite simple. Then all of a sudden your next trial is, boom, Maw of Lorkhaj. You've got to be running around the room, moving, switching bosses, moving this, moving that, going over there, hiding, cleansing, chaining. There's a lot to do comparatively in there compared to the Craglords. It's like insanely like higher difficulty level. So we can slot that there for now, I think. M. A couple of you agree, M or A? Yeah, I think A probably as well, but we'll get there in a second with that. We'll reevaluate it at the end and see where we're at. Okay, the next trial that came out was Halls of Fabrications. Halls of Fabrications has 5 bosses, guys. It's the biggest trial in the game in terms of the amount of enemies to kill and all that kind of stuff. 5 different enemies. All with different mechanics as well. It's not like they're similar. There's not a single boss in there that's similar to another one. I actually think from like a new tank that's never done it, main tanking it for the first ever time, that this is probably one of the most difficult trials in the game. By far. When you think second boss, boss 2, when you get pinned to the ground, you've got to block the shades. That's tough. That's tough for a new player to even understand. If you explain that to somebody and they've never actually physically seen it, it's extremely difficult for them to understand how to actually do that mechanic. Then you've got the triplets, and you've got, like, everything requires quite good timing and movement. And so I do think this is probably the hardest trial in the game for a new player. Like, it's definitely on the higher end of the scale. Is it really S tier? Is it the hardest trial? Do you guys think there's a harder trial than VHOF to learn? Like, if you've never done VHOF before, considering all the mechanics as a main tank, do you think there's a harder trial than VHOF to learn? The 2 bosses, when you've got the first boss, quite difficult as well. If you do the beam strategy, you've got to move the bosses around the room and beam all the ads. That's difficult. If you don't do that, you stack it on the entrance and it makes it a bit easier. But then you've still got to, like, position the boss right and avoid those AoEs. You've still got to try and bring things in. I do think that this is the hardest trial in the game. So, like, if we look at non-hard mode, do you really think that Cloudrest is harder than VHOF to main tank from a beginner perspective? If you've been in there and you know what the environment's like, yeah, it would be easy. You've also got to remember that VMOL and VHOF were created around a time where the max, like the average player was probably around 300-400 CP. Like, these trials were aimed at 300 CP kinds of players. Do you know what I mean? On the old CP system. So the amount of damage that you take in, like, nowadays, when you've got people with 3,600 CP, and you've got a maxed out CP system, the game has changed so much since these two trials came out. Mechanically, they're difficult. The amount of damage you take is very, very small, though. Like in VHOF, the amount of damage you take in VHOF is very, very small. For example, the triplets, you can take a heavy attack unblocked and it's not going to kill you, as long as they're not beamed. It does require a lot of effort mechanically, though. I think VHOF, we'll leave VHOF at S tier for now. We might have to move VMOL up a little bit, because I think that was pretty difficult. But as I'm saying, the damage on these two trials is super, super low. Okay, next trial that came out after this would be Asylum Sanctorium. We're going in trial order of when they were released. So Asylum Sanctorium would be the next trial. Now, this trial is so easy that it's considered like a carry role for anybody who is going into this trial for the first time. The weird thing is, right, this is a hard trial to tank in regards to just positioning mainly. The positioning is the problem, because when you take a new tank in there, if they make the boss walk too far back and they kill the healer, that's an issue. If people are dying, then it's an issue. The damage from the light attacks is like 20k, 25k damage, and if you've only got 35k health, you're nearly dead from one light attack. But all of the things are like overcome very, very easily. I do think it's easier to tank Asylum Sanctorium than it is to tank VEA, for example, because the damage is just so slow. The only thing that really could kill you as the main tank, I guess, would be the Heavens. The Heavens is the only difficult mechanic in there for the main tank, because if they don't stand in the right place and they get hit 1, 2, 3, 4 times by the lightning on the floor, then they're obviously going to die. But you get so much time. It's like you got a heavy attack by the boss, then you've got 5 seconds, and then you've got another heavy attack. You can heavy attack the boss back, so you've got no excuse for like poor sustain. You've got no excuse for having no health because you've got so much time. So it's like, it's really, really difficult. In VAS 0, the main tank can kite around like crazy. True. It's non-hard. Yeah, I suppose for non-hard mode, yeah. Yeah, I would say it's probably easier than the Craglorns then, isn't it, to be fair? Because I think the thing is the damage is so slow. When you think, if we're doing non-hard mode or Lothis, when you have to do the side bosses and you have to go and kill Lothis, as the main tank, what have you got to do? Bash, run, move out the poison. Quite easy. Felms, tank the main boss, the ads, and just stand still. There isn't really any movement. There's no movement at all required. There's nothing that's, you don't need to do anything. You kind of just stood there. So, yeah, I think this is probably F tier, because, or at least equal to these two. Okay, what trial came out of this? Cloudrest came out next. How do we rate Cloudrest in terms of the difficulty of main tank in this trial? For a brand new tank, I think the most difficult part about it is probably the portal. Like, if you are brand new to tanking, I would say the most difficult part is the portal. Like, tanking the Griffin, it can be fine. Tanking the mini-bosses is fine. Tanking Zamaja is fine. It's going in the portal that's going to be the issue there. I think that's the biggest problem. It's like, everything else is fine. Like, the rest of the trial is easy. It's actually going into the portal where you're left to your own devices, and especially if you get the dot when you go in the portal and you get hit by that dot, and all of a sudden it's like damage, like huge incoming damage. That's really, really hard to deal with for like experienced tanks, let alone a brand new player. So I do think it's actually quite higher up just because of the portal. I don't think it's that difficult. I think it's quite easy to do Cloudrest. I just think the portal is very, very difficult. Like, the Griffin can be a challenge. If you take every single light attack from the Griffin, you've got a huge dot. If you don't know to roll dodge at least some of the hits, you're going to be in a real sticky situation. You're going to have no sustain. On the mini bosses, if you keep getting stunned by the different attacks that they do, that's going to kill you as well. The last boss, like I say, is quite easy. You've got the heavy attack. The kite can be quite difficult sometimes because it can be a little bit buggy, where you're not stood inside the kite AoE, but it still hits you. You can lose aggro of Zamaja if you've got the 2 tanks that are switching the boss over. And if somebody taunts and then taunts again, and then the second tank comes along and taunts it, and then you've got taunt immunity, they could lose taunt because there's going to be 12 seconds of taunt immunity. But it's the portal. I would say just because of the portal, this is at least equal to VMOL in difficulty. But for a completely different reason. And obviously this trial, Cloudrest, is a much higher damage trial. There's a much higher incoming damage in Cloudrest compared to Maw of Lorkhaj. But Maw of Lorkhaj is obviously much more mechanically challenging. In terms of every boss fight is mechanically heavy. Execute phase, yeah, true. Xander's good point, mate. The execute phase. If you're the main tank, you do an execute. Yeah, that's a bit of a challenge. I actually think, yeah, because of the execute and the portal, I think that could be quite tricky. I think Cloudrest may be a step up from VMOL just because of the portal and the execute phase for a brand new tank like that. Yeah, I think that could be a real challenge. Over taunting and going portal is a group. Yeah, the whole group can get killed just because of over taunting. I think, yeah, just because of portal and execute phase, Cloudrest goes to A for me. We can adjust this afterwards, but for now, this is what we've got. Next trial would be VSS, Sunspire. Yeah, I think if you just think, right, all three fights are basically the same for a main tank. If you're brand new, you just stand there and it's just Dragon Breath and Heavy Attack. There's two mechanics. That's all you've got in VSS. If you consider the fact that you're brand new, it's two mechanics. Ice boss, you stand in the breath, and then you block the heavy attack. Second boss, stand in the breath, heavy attack. That's an AoE heavy attack this time. You have to step out of it. Last boss, breath, heavy attack. The difficult part is the add phases. So on the Locustes fight, the add phase is the difficult part. The boss is easy. It's the add phase that's hard, because if you don't run the adds into the lightning pools, then you're going to have loads of adds. Then it makes it hard for the off tank. And if the off tank dies, then you've got to take the adds, and then your whole group wipe. So even though it's the off tank's job, it's still your responsibility to help with that. When you get onto Yolnakrin, you might not be dealing with the adds, so that's easy. On the last boss, you've got the debuff, which makes it kind of difficult. So the debuff though, you've got to remember the armor shatter that you get, the mark for death that you get on the last boss, it's super, super easy to manage nowadays. It's much easier now than it used to be. It used to be really hard, now it's not. You can just Igneous Shield through it. If you've got the healer healing you, it shouldn't be a problem. In that situation, the off tank should 1,000,000% be guarding the main tank. There's no reason for an off tank in VSS with a beginner main tank. The off tank is not doing anything. They're chaining in some flame atros. They should 1,000,000% be guarding the main tank. If they're not doing that, then it's a real problem. It's a raid leader problem. It's a group problem. They should be doing it. They 1,000,000% should be doing it. And there should be a healer focusing heals on the main tank as well, because there's two healers. If you've got a beginner group, two healers, one healer can heal the group, one healer can heal the tank. You don't need two healers healing a group of 12, like the 11 other people in the group who are taking 0 damage. So you've got to consider the facts. It's the add phase. Like if the tank is marked for death, the boss flies in the air, and then you've got the main tank who's got to take 2 adds. That's when it starts getting hard. That's when it's difficult. Is VSS more difficult than Sanctum? That's the question. Is VSS more difficult than VEA and Hel Ra? Like I'm saying, the only difficult part about VSS for me is the ad pulls, and the ad pulls during the boss fights. That is the hard part. That's the only thing that really takes it. I would say VSS is easier. When if you're just looking at it from the perspective of just tanking the dragons, it's easier than Sanctum. But when you consider the ad pulls and the ad phases during the boss fight, that's when I start to think it's more difficult. How many times have you seen a group wipe on the last boss of VSS on the last ad phase because the 2 tanks are dead? I've seen that a lot. Like we would never surely wipe in Sanctum or Hel Ra or VEA. So I do, yeah, I'd maybe C tier is probably right for VSS. But I think it's only slightly more difficult than these. Okay, we're going to reevaluate in a second. Once we've got them all on the list, we will reevaluate where we're at. So next trial would be, get ready for it, Kyne's Aegis. Kyne's Aegis. Now, probably, the only reason that Kyne's Aegis for me Kyne's Aegis is S tier, and I'll tell you why. Because it requires so much effort not to fall asleep that that's what makes it difficult. That's the thing that makes it difficult, is it's so boring that you have to find something to keep it interesting to keep yourself awake. No, but in all seriousness, if you take, again, ad pulls, the ad pulls in the ad pulls in Kyne's Aegis are really challenging. It's got the hardest ad pull in the game, in my opinion, or at least one of the hardest ad pulls. Equally one of the hardest ad pulls with the last ad pull before the last boss. Let's presume we're not skipping it, because why would you skip an ad pull that you're going to struggle for the rest of your ESO lifetime to do if you skip it? You need to know how to do these things. Like, you shouldn't skip content. There's no point. Just learn to do it properly. Learn how to deal with it. Learn how to overcome it, so that you know in the future, if you become a really good player and you start getting into better teams, you've actually had the experience of dealing with it. If you don't ever learn to deal with it, then you look really stupid later on down the line when you try and get into a group. Like, let's say you've done Kyne's Aegis 50 times. You've skipped the last ad pull every time. And then all of a sudden, you go, well, I'm going to try and do a prog now, where we're going to go for Dawnbringer. And you tell the raid leader, yeah, I want to join your group for Dawnbringer, but I've never ever once done the last ad pull because my group always skip it. Like, it doesn't make sense, does it? When you think of the bosses, if we're looking at non-hard mode, the first boss, you stand there, you hold block, you block the heavy attack, you roll dodge the cleave. That is all the mechanics. Second boss is a little bit challenging. I think second boss is a little bit challenging. So the second boss, you stand there, taunt the boss, you hold block. It's the frigid fog that's the problem. When you get the frigid fog and you have to break free and roll dodge and take the boss with you out of it, that's a semi-challenging mechanic, but it's quite a rare mechanic in that trial. You might get it once or twice, maybe 3 times max the entire fight. The problem is if you get that in execute, where you've got the ad beamed to you and attached to you, that can one-shot you with a light attack. That's the only time that actually the frigid fog is dangerous. But then you can use slippery CP, you can use immovable potions. There is ways to kind of avoid it. So if you were a beginner tank, you would potentially try to avoid getting frozen by the frigid fog. The last boss, let's presume you've got the off tank taking the lieutenant. All you've got to do is stand there in the middle of the room and just tank one boss. And it's a long boss. It's very, very long. It can take 15 minutes to kill the last boss, especially if you're with a newer group. Even on non-hard mode, it's quite a long fight. And one of the things you've got to remember is, even on non-hard mode, if we consider all non-hard mode trials, Kyne's Aegis, right, the last boss, you take more damage in that one fight than you do in the whole trial of every other trial. So, like, if you do Sunspire, if you look at the damage that you take from the entire trial at the end, you take less damage in the whole of the Sunspire trial versus one fight in Kyne's Aegis. So the sheer amount, the volume of damage that you're taking in Kyne's Aegis, even for non-hard mode, is considerably higher than every other trial in the game. So that kind of pushes it up a little bit for me. Like, it's a very basic trial. It's very, like, effortless in terms of mechanics. But if you were a new player, getting swatted for, like, nearly your full health quite often is going to be a challenge. You've got to think on the second floor on last boss. That's going to be the hard one, the sustain, where you've got the barbed wire around your character, and it's ticking every, like, I think it's every half a second, or maybe even every 0.25 seconds. And your stamina bar can go from full to nothing in about 10 seconds if you are blocking the entire time. So you've got to have guard. You've got to have guard so you can drop block, so you can take some light attacks without blocking, so you can heavy attack, so you can sustain. And to be comfortable doing that is not something a newer tank would typically do. So you are having to go out of your comfort zone to be able to sustain that last boss fight. So I do think this kind of pushes it up a little bit, because it's just an incredible amount of damage. It's harder than Sunspire. It's harder than VMOL in terms of the damage you take, but it's not as hard in terms of the mechanics. So, would we say it's comparable to VMOL, or is it harder than VMOL? What do you guys think? Does anybody think that Kyne's Aegis is equally as difficult to VCR? When we've considered VCR's difficulty level is the portals and the execute phase, do you think Kyne's Aegis is more difficult or equally as difficult as that? That's what we've got to consider here. Because you've got to remember that there's a lot of ad pulls in Kyne's Aegis and they're very, very difficult. Cloudrest doesn't have any ad pulls really. The hard part, portals, execute. The hard part in Kyne's Aegis is the ad pulls, and it's that last boss, and there's a couple of like tricky mechanics to deal with, like the frigid fog and the second floor on the last boss. I think those are quite challenging. And the sheer volume of damage you take on the last boss could be a challenge. So I'm not sure. I'm kind of like, it's definitely between these two. Okay. The last trial. Rockgrove. Non-hard mode Rockgrove. Hard mode, like if we're thinking non-hard mode Rockgrove. I don't think Rockgrove is super difficult in terms of non-hard mode. The ad pulls, again, this is where it's going to push it up. This is where it's going to push it up near, like, because is Rockgrove more difficult than Kyne's Aegis? I would say it probably, I think so. There's more to think about in Rockgrove than Kyne's Aegis. You've got the first boss, which isn't that difficult, but you've got a lot of ads to deal with. You've got the boss, you've got to keep it there, it's going to charge, it's going to come back, you've got to make sure that AoE drops in the right place. The ad pulls, again, are what are going to make Rockgrove, because the ad pulls in Rockgrove are consistently more difficult, I think, than Kyne's Aegis. You've got like an equally hard ad pull, where you've got the big red dudes in there, you've got the barbarian and stuff. But like if you roll dodge every light attack from a barbarian, it doesn't really do anything. Whereas you don't have an equivalent way of avoiding all of the damage in Kyne's Aegis. Like in Kyne's Aegis, you've just got so many ads. You need to taunt that one, that one, that one, that one. They all need to be pulled in. They need or run away or stacked away. In Rockgrove, you just taunt in like two guys, two ads, and then you roll dodge. And you roll dodge the light attack. So you can, it's kind of avoidable in a way. Or you can taunt them and hit Magma Shell. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, the ad pulls are difficult in Rockgrove, but I think it's hard to say. First boss in Rockgrove, pretty simple. The off-tank has the harder job, I think, there. Taking the barbarians, making sure... It's the positioning for the first boss, because if they get too close, the boss and the barbarian get too close, then obviously that creates where they get enraged. So that's the hard part. That's the only tricky part, really. The second boss... Obviously with the curse isn't that difficult in non-hard mode. You can just spam Igneous Shield through it. You can just heal yourself through it. The healers can heal you through it quite easily. However, if you're like, it depends on how you move. I don't think the main tank's particularly got a really hard job in there. But it does require you to kind of know a bit about what you're supposed to do, because you can't just stand in the middle of the room with the boss like you do in most fights. Like in a lot of boss fights, in a lot of trials, you just tank the boss wherever it lands or wherever it is. This is where I'm kind of considering sliding these down to here to kind of put it in between, because I don't know if Rockgrove would make, because I think it's a bit harder. Like I think Rockgrove is more of a challenge than Maw of Lorkhaj, and probably more of a challenge than Kyne's Aegis, but it's not as difficult as like the portals and the execute is quite tricky there. Then the last boss, again, there's just a lot of ads to deal with, and the damage is quite hard even on non-hard mode, but you can just use immovable, and the damage all of a sudden is very, very small. So I don't think the last boss is that difficult. It is mainly just bar sign, the curse, and the ad pulls that make Rockgrove challenging. The tier list we've come to is this. So just to recap, this is a tier list for tanking as the main tank in Veteran Trials non-hard mode. Looking at it from a beginner's perspective, and what we've got so far is the hardest trial in the game being VHOF for a main tank who has never done it before. Secondly, we've got Cloudrest because of the Execute and the Portal. We've got Rockgrove because of Barsai and the ad pulls being quite tricky and high damage. At B tier, we've got Maw of Lorkhaj because of the mechanics involved. There's a lot of mechanic-intensive situations in there on all the bosses. Even the ad pulls in there are quite challenging to certain points where, like, you have to stack the ads and you have to bring these ads and you have to bash that one and dodge roll that one and there's things to do. And then we've got Kyne's Aegis, which is on a similar level. Not because Kyne's Aegis is quite basic mechanically, but you've got like high damage situations and very, very difficult ad pulls. Then we've got Sunspire. And Sunspire is quite easy in terms of the bosses only have two real mechanics, a heavy attack and the Dragon Breath. That's not the difficult part. Again, ad pulls and the ad phases during the boss fights, which make that kind of difficult, especially on the last boss. The last boss ad pulls can be tricky, especially if you've debuffed. Next, we've got Sanctum Ophidia, mainly because it's just an annoying trial. And dealing with the ad pulls, again, can be quite a challenge, and there's a lot of poison going on, and the bosses need somewhat positioning reasonably well. Like the last boss, if you're not positioned it well, it can cleave your group. There's things like that that make it just a little bit more difficult than some other stuff. At E tier, we've got Aetherian Archive. Now, Aetherian Archive is kind of a challenge, I think, because of the axes. So the whole trial is very, very easy. You don't even need to block a single attack from a single enemy, a single boss, a single ad in Aetherian Archive until you get to the last boss. You can actually tank this as a damage dealer until you get to the last boss. Then you have to block. And once you've got the axes can be challenging. So as a beginner tank, I do think Aetherian Archive is still quite challenging, because if you've got 3 or 4 axes, you're taking it's quite a difficult challenge sometimes to sustain that and to make sure you've got aggro of those axes the whole time. Then we've got, on an equal tier, we've got Hel Ra, and Hel Ra isn't as difficult as dealing with the axes. However, the bosses all require much more attention. So the first boss spins around, does quite a lot of damage. Second boss, the Welwers, they can hurt. The last boss is a hard-hitting fight with 1,000 cuts from the main boss. So it's a bit of a challenge in that regards because it's high damage, but it's not like super difficult. Mechanically, you just kind of stand there. F tier, the absolute easiest trial in the game we voted for the main tank, is Asylum Sanctorium. And Asylum Sanctorium can be a bit of a challenge, but it's literally one mechanic that's challenging. It's the heavens. The boss attacks are so slow. Once every 5 seconds, it does a light attack. It does a Dragon Breath, which you can just step out of. The boss jumps, and you just stand there and block. The difficult thing is just the heavens. And if you stand underneath the boss next to the lightning pool, and you use Purge if you get hit by the lightning, it doesn't do anything. And you've got so much time to heavy attack and not really have to do anything. The challenging part is just making sure the positioning's right. Making sure that you're not getting the spits or the breath in the group. That's the only hard part. And I do think that that is definitely the easiest trial. So that's our trial tier list, guys. But yeah, if you've got any thoughts or comments in the chat, let me know.